Well, and welcome everybody, and happy Fat Tuesday to you. And no, I did not overindulge in poochkies, so I'm in fine shape to handle the host and master of ceremony duties for today's ball publishing webinar, which is aptly titled for Mardi Gras, by the way, Dare to Go Bear. Root, that is. As usual, I'm Chris Beytes, editor of GrowerTalks and Green Profit magazines and the e-newsletter Acres Online, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so as we explore the nuts and bolts, so to speak, of bare root perennials. And I'll tell you what, judging from the turnout today, this is going to be a hot topic, which is why we have enlisted the services of a guest expert who is definitely up to the challenge. He is Mr. Jeremy Windemuller, trial manager for Walters Gardens in Zeeland, Michigan. Are you there, Jeremy?
I am. Thanks, Chris.
Beautiful. Now, how are things in Zeeland today?
Fairly warm. A little too warm for this early.
Is that throwing your perennial schedule off?
Things are starting to grow already, which is a concern. But hey, I'm up for the challenge every year.
Well, that's good because we assume that you know how to handle all that kind of stuff. But let me ask you, what does your role as trial manager? How does it make you our expert specifically in bare root perennials today?
Well, I do a lot of trials. When we introduce new varieties, we decide, hey, if this is a field item, we're going to send it to the field. We will do some bare root grow outs in the field, as well as potting those up and seeing how they perform before we decide, hey, that's the best route for that plant to go. So I'm in charge of most of the internal trials in the greenhouse as far as forcing goes. So I am probably one of the only finished growers on site here. I do something completely different than everyone else here at Walters does. We're primarily a plug grower and a bare root grower. I get to have the fun challenge of growing plants for trials as well as trade shows. So. And besides working at Walters, I'm also a retail grower myself. I have my own nursery, so I'm not only speaking to you as a trial manager, but I kind of fill in your shoes as well as a lot of the listeners here today. I'm growing these things for my own nursery, so it's I've learned a lot over the past 15 years.
So you're a customer as well.
Correct. Yes.
Which makes you most critical. And of course, well, that's me in my Mardi Gras attire broadcasting from the 144th floor of the Ball Publishing Tower. Quick little bit of housekeeping, and based on the fact that nobody has typed in that they can't hear me right now, that's pretty good because what I would normally do is I would put this slide up for those folks who aren't hearing anything. And because I can't tell them, obviously. I figured that one out eventually. So for anyone who can't hear, I hope they're reading this. They'll go, aha, that's how I get the audio. And then they'll be able to enjoy this webinar to its fullest because, pictures are great, but we got to hear the voice. And if you have questions as we go along, use either the chat area or the Q&A area as you prefer. The Q&A area is probably easier for you. Type them in. I will pass them along to Jeremy if it's appropriate with the topic we happen to be on. I don't want to, go all over the field here, but we'll also try to get to as many as we can at the end, and then I'll give you his email address at the end in case you want some follow-up. And if worse comes to worse and you have to leave the webinar, heaven forbid, it will be archived and probably within an hour or so of its conclusion at the usual spot, ballpublishing.com/webinars, the same place you signed up. So that said, Jeremy, you've got a lot of slides. I want to let you dive in. You all set?
I am.
All right, let's take it away.
All right. Well, thanks a lot very much, Chris, for that intro. And I'm first going to start off with the reasons that I dared to go bare root, that is. Best reason I can think of is for quick turn crops. Nursery space is a premium to me, especially in the spring months when you're really trying to cram every little square inch of your greenhouse or nursery full. Having a quick turn crop is important to be able to get that crop finished and shipped as quick as possible and allow for the early to midsummer crops to come in. So if I'm not planting a crop the summer prior from a smaller plug, I'm usually looking for options of plants that are available as bare root that I can plant in the spring. And typically, if a grower is buying in small plugs in the spring, they don't normally fill out a container as nice as what a bare root plant would. Sure, the input costs are going to be slightly higher with a bare root plant compared to, let's say, a 72 count plug, but the results will speak for themselves. You're going to have a much better premium plant on the bench in a much shorter period of time. And if we go to the next slide there, Chris. So really with finishing containers, the bare root plants tend to fill out the containers with minimal to no pinching. And I know with the labor shortages around, it's tough to get in the crops and really give them the maintenance they need to fill out real nice. And what I see with bare root plants is they really seem to do that without without much effort, with minimal pinching to no pinching. And also I like bare root plants because they will be received vernalized if they're purchased in the spring. So you're having a larger size plant that has its cold requirements met going directly into the container, and it's going to fill out, and it also allows you to go into cooler environments than you would be able to with an actively growing plug. Typically, actively growing plugs are going to have to be planted in a greenhouse maybe around 65 degrees to start growing, where the bare root plants will become active at around 50 to 55 degrees. So it saves you a little bit of money on the fuel side as well. And next slide there. And one more. So, another option too for bare root plants is to go into larger containers. There's a lot of growers looking at options for a 2 and 3 gallon program. The problem with using plugs in this type of situation is either it's an extremely long growing season, or you're putting multiple inputs per container. And that runs into an issue when you see a lot of these new varieties coming to the market. They have tags and royalties and all that stuff on them. You don't want to start paying for multiple royalties, multiple labels and all that stuff. With a bare root, you can put a single input into a container. And sure, it's going to be a little bit longer growing period than what a 1 gallon would be, but it allows you to have actually a fairly reasonable input cost for a large container. And next slide. Oh, one more, Chris. There we go. And the next slide I'm going to talk about here is what we do to grow these bare root plants. Now, Walter's Gardens is located in western Michigan. We have wonderful sandy loam soils here that are rich and fertile. We have great water sources and a great climate to grow in. So during the summer months, a lot is planted out into the field. A lot of this stuff is either from divisions or from small plugs that we grow in our greenhouse facility here that's transplanted. And then a majority of the crops, like you see some Heliopsis, it looks like some Euphorbia bonfire, and then looks like some Perovskia off in the distance there. Those plants are typically planted from a plug in this early spring, and it's grown for the entire summer, and then we harvest them going into the fall months. And next slide. And here's a shot of some of our daylily fields. Looks like some Stella de Oro daylilies there. Those are more on a 1.5 to 2 year program, so they're in the field a little bit longer. We want to size up these plants so we get multiple divisions per clump that comes out of the field. And you can see that it does require a lot of water. We get some dry summers here once in a while, but at least we have good rivers surrounding a lot of our fields that we're able to pump from and keep the moisture at the prime rate that we need to grow the plants. And this is just a couple shots of some of the harvests that we do here coming into the fall months. Generally, we're starting to harvest after we get a good couple hard killing frosts on the plant. We want the plant to go in that dormant state before we start digging them. Once that happens, we typically run a machine over top of them that will top the plants, a flail chopper, something like that. And then we send an advanced harvester through, and what that does is it basically lifts the plants out of the ground, like the photo you see on the left. And what that does is it helps condition the plants for storage. We don't want the plants going in extremely wet. We don't want them to go in extremely dry. So there's some process to that. But what we do is we lay them up, And if they're on the drier side, they may only lay there for a couple hours. And then we come by with the harvester like you see in the right photo there. It pulls a trailer with 8 cribs on there, and all it does is basically lifts them back up off the ground. It does one final shake to the plant, gets a little bit of the extra sand off of them, and then they go into the cribs where they're labeled, and then they're sent to our plant here in Zealand where we process those. And the next slide we're going to talk about are some different types of bare root plants. And fibrous roots are probably the most common bare root perennial you'll see in the market. They're generally well branched. They're smaller, finer roots, and they're typically easy to divide. And the picture you see there is of one of our #1 grade Coreopsis moonbeam plants, probably one of our top selling bare root plants there. And you can see they're large enough that you could divide them. They divide very, very easily. So this is a plant that you see a lot of growers sometimes propagate on their own from their own divisions. But some other ones that are in this category would be Veronicas, daylilies, Achillea. Those are some of the other popular ones that we see there. Generally, these like to be grown moderately moist to slightly dry. The next one would be taproots. There's a few of these, but there's not near as many of these as the fibrous root varieties. It's mainly one that has a larger taproot coming down the center, and you get some side branching with a root. The photo you see there is some platycodon. Generally, these are grown quite dry. They send their roots deep enough where they can get the moisture deeper in the ground. Another one would be Gypsophila. So these are not plants that can be divided. Like the platycodon you see there, that's direct seeded into our field, so it's not a plant that we divide and put back out there again. And generally, you want to plant these with the crown even with the soil line. You want to avoid planting them too deep, otherwise it could cause the plant to rot. And the next one is rhizome, and most people are familiar with the tall bearded iris. And what that is basically a horizontal stem growing across the surface of the soil or slightly below, and then the roots form off of that. And as far as planting instructions go for plants like this, usually you want to see that rhizome exposed, maybe about 1/3 above the soil line there. Again, planting too deep will cause that plant to fall backwards as far as productivity goes. And the last one will be a corm. And I apologize about the picture. I kind of rushed last week and tried to find one I could take a picture of, and everything was bagged up. So if you can see closely there, you see some of the stems starting to poke out a little bit. But I like to think of corms as just like little mini tulip bulbs. Cosmea is probably our best example of what we sell as a corm. Generally, these are planted slightly deep. So like a Cosmea, we're looking at planting those 2 to 3 inches below the soil surface. And what that does is it allows some support for that stem as it grows. And next slide there, bare root grades. So there's a lot of different options as far as bare root goes, as far as what you want to invest in the plant input. Our most popular selling grade is obviously our bare root #1 grade. And these are typically put into trade 1 gallons, full 1 gallons, and 2 gallon containers. Generally, like the daylilies you see in the picture there, as a grower, I typically would put something like this into a full 1 gallon container, a full 4-quart, rather than the cheater 2 gallon or cheater 1 gallon. And in the springtime, you can finish these off in roughly 6 to 8 weeks. And then our grade 2 and 3 bare root. Now we're starting to offer more and more of these now because we see the need for a lower input cost in the bare root market. So this is a great option for a lot of larger growers who are putting large numbers in. And even as a smaller nursery like myself, I do go with a grade 2 on certain items there. I do feel that they fill out the container really nice, especially if you're going to do a trade gallon container. And typically I would be looking at, like with these daylilies here, putting these into a container in July and August in the summer months, utilizing that heat to really bulk that plant. So I get a nice finished container going into dormancy, and that allows me to have a nice full container to go to either landscapers or retailers in the spring. and you can expect around a 7 to 9 week rooting time on a plant like that. And then,
Jeremy, quick question.
Yeah, sure.
On the grades, is it only size that you're grading? Is there any kind of a quality issue with them, and can you quantify the size a little bit between 1, 2, and 3?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. Well, typically grade 1 is going to be either a full plant directly out of the field or something that was divided down, like with the daylily clumps, like I mentioned earlier, they're grown for 1.5 to 2 years in the field. So we can expect to maybe yield 2 to 3, possibly 4 number 1 grade bare root plants out of a clump. So like you see the picture there, that's Happy Returns hemerocallis, and it's looking between 4 and 5 fans on a plant like that. So our grade 1 bare root plants that are domestically grown are fairly generous in size compared to some of the other stuff that's available on the market. Our grade 2, you're probably expecting maybe in a daily, maybe around 3 fans, possibly 2. And depending on the variety, like the grade 3 is going to be a 1 to 2 fan. And that really depends on the variety of the daylilies. Some, like Happy Returns, have smaller fans, where other varieties have the really heavy duty fans. That's something that might actually, cause it to be maybe a 1 to 2 fan versus a 4 to 5.
Gotcha. Strictly a size issue, certainly nothing to do with the quality of the.
Correct. Yeah. We generally, like with the division type plant, it's something we're still taking a full size plant from the field that's still vigorous and everything, and we're dividing it into the size that the grower requests.
All right. Thanks.
So what are some of the top bare root crops available out there? And I got a long list of plants here that these are all ones I grow at my nursery from bare root. I think these are the best way to go with some of these if you want a shorter crop time. But I'm going to hit a few that I really want to emphasize. And the first one's going to be a stilby. I've grown stilbies from plugs, and I've grown some from bare root. And really what we've grown here at Walters domestically is been a huge change. We used to get a lot of product from Europe, and the problem is with some of that is it tends to get hot dipped in order to be exported to the United States. So we are able to skip that process here because they're grown domestically, and it doesn't take the vigor out of the plant. It's not in the shipping process near as long, and the general size tends to be much larger. So typically with a stilby, I'm seeing, like this past year, around 3 to 4 eyes coming up out of the soil, and these are going to fill a nice full 1 gallon container with no problem in the spring. Some other of my favorites would be like Coreopsis. I've grown Coreopsis from 72 count plugs, specifically Moonbeam. It's a struggle even when planting them in late summer to really get a nice full container. So with bare root, it's pretty much drop it in the pot, let it root, and it fills out the container in a hurry. Hemerocallis, we already touched on that. It's probably one of the top bare root plants that Walters offers. And the next one, hibiscus. And this is something that Walters has really hit the market with, that bare root program. It's fairly new. I think we're probably into our 5th season possibly with that now. It's typically something we grew as larger plugs and smaller plugs. But we found that bare root is a great way to go for quick turn crops. And typically these are put into 2 to 3 gallon containers. And I'm seeing anywhere from 4 to 6 eyes on a lot of these bare root hibiscus. And what's nice about that too is the branching is formed at the crown, where if you're planting it from a plug, a lot of times that branching is where you pinch the plant. So that's much higher up the plant. So it actually gives you a nicer, well-rounded plant from bare root in a shorter amount of time. And
Ann wants to know what hot dipped is. You mentioned that.
Oh, sure. That's a great question. Well, basically, when things are shipped from overseas, they have to go through a sterilization process in order to be imported into the United States. So what that is, it's put in a tank of hot water just to basically sterilize it. A lot of it's for like the nematodes, stuff like that. I'm not sure what the temperature is that they dip that at, but it's, like I said, it's just a way to sterilize the plant. You go back one slide there, Chris.
Oh, sorry. I'm getting ahead of you here.
Yeah, that's fine. Couple more items I want to touch on here. Peonies are a definite one to plant from bare root. Typically Walters sells most of their bare root peonies in the fall. I see that as a great time to plant them because you're getting some roots set in the container, you're developing those eyes, and it's ready to go for the following spring. Spring planted peonies generally end up being much smaller in size, not as many eyes develop, and it really almost looks like a full season's difference in growth on there. And I'm going to touch on three more here. Perovskia is another one I really recommend from bare root. I've grown them from small plugs, and they tend to be on the softer side at the crown just because there's not much size to that base yet. But with our bare root plants coming out of the field, you have a nice woody base for the new growth to form on the following season. So you can pretty much pick those containers right up and hold them sideways. The branches stay nice and straight. They don't flop over. So I really see Perovskia as a no-brainer for bare root. Phlox paniculata, tall phlox. These are ones too that I do some from plugs in late summer and hold them through the winter, and I still don't think they add up to the number of eyes I see developed on a spring planted bare root plant. So there's a lot less pinching again involved with that as well. And then the last one I'm going to hit on here is sedum. Walter's sedum program for bare root has grown a lot. Again, this is another one too that the eye development on our bare root plants will far exceed what you'll expect from a small plug planted into a container the summer prior. And I'll actually show you a slide further down the presentation that will show you the difference. So, all right, Chris, we're ready to move on. So as far as what to do when you receive your bare root order, first thing you want to do is to open the boxes. This is very important. These plants cannot stay in these boxes for very long at warmer temperatures. So you want to make sure that you inspect the order as soon as it comes in. If you're not able to transplant them right away, they need to be stored in a cool location. Do not put them in a greenhouse with clear poly. That's going to heat up during the day. It's going to cause a lot of problems for the grower. So typically we like to see these stored at 35 to 40 degrees, and I would say maybe for 2 to 3 days at the most. Next slide. So as far as inspecting the bare root plants, things you want to look for, the bare roots should be firm, relatively dry. Most of the plants are going to be lighter in brown color, but you want to look for mushy growth, anything like that. And if it's at the tips of the roots, a lot of times you can do a slight trim on them and just trim that off, and the plant's perfectly fine. Some plants you might notice when you open them up might have a little bit of light surface mold on there, and that's nothing to be alarmed about. And generally that's formed because of the humidity that's in the bag or in the box there. And that's not going to harm the growth of the plant. So there's no need really to treat the plants if you see any mold on there. If you desire, you can give, like I said, you can give it a light trim on the roots, that's fine. But a lot of times that mold will disappear once you open the box and provide some air circulation. So if the roots arrive frozen, and a majority of our product is held in freezers, so if the temperatures on a truck are cool enough that it's not going to thaw, then you might have to put them into a cool greenhouse or a building for a day or two. And once you open those bags and boxes up, 40 to 50 degrees will thaw them fairly quickly. A lot of times I will open them up and then just kind of fluff some of the aspen that's packed in there, just to kind of break that up a little bit and allow some air to flow around them. Generally, I see them thawing in a matter of a few hours. And like I mentioned earlier, do not put them immediately into a warm greenhouse, especially once they're potted too. And then some plants that maybe have fine roots that, it might seem a little on the dry side. You're welcome to soak them in a tub of water for an hour before potting. I know this probably is a little bit more labor than some growers want to do, and typically I don't see an issue with that. I don't ever run into an issue where I had to soak them, but you can put them in some water, and this helps them establish more quickly. Now, as far as planting goes, bare root is always should take priority over planting plugs. When you receive your order, if you're receiving both of them, put the plugs in a cool greenhouse, and then focus on potting the bare root plants first. And when going through the list of plants that you ordered, if you have anything that's an evergreen plant, such as lavender, iberis, phlox subulata, these are plants that should immediately be potted up because of the evergreen foliage can tend to be dried out in a hurry if left exposed. So you want to get these in the container, make sure the roots are covered, and water them in thoroughly as soon as you transplant them. And a lot of times with these evergreen type bare root plants, I find it very beneficial to put like a light frost blanket, like a half-ounce frost blanket on top of the crop, even in a greenhouse, because what that does is it allows the plant to start getting some roots established, and it keeps the moisture around the plant rather than allowing it to transpire so quickly. These plants cannot pull up moisture right away until the feeder roots are developed. So it's very important that you make sure that the plants do not dry out. These should not go into a warm greenhouse. And periodically, I might even lightly spritz some water on them just to help keep some moisture on that plant until it can get established. But you don't want the soil to be extremely wet. Basically, you want to water them in thoroughly and back off on them until the roots have developed. So as far as perennials, oh, sorry, Chris, I'm not quite done there yet. Perennials that have thick, fleshy roots can typically be held longer, and things I'm thinking about would be something like Baptisia, daylilies, or fall in that category. They're ones that tend to store very well, and those are ones you could probably put at the tail end of the list. And then just remember to pot up all your bare root as soon as you possibly can. So what are the proper conditions for growing bare root? As far as spring potting goes, we want to make sure temperatures are kept above freezing. So you want to avoid really warm greenhouse temperatures, but cold, wet conditions may cause the plants to fall backwards and rot. So it's very important that you kind of seek a location that's maybe 50 to 55 degrees. Is so often I see growers putting their perennials, especially bare root, in with the annuals, and that's usually a no-no. It just doesn't work. Perennials really should be given their own environment, and some perennials actually require a separate environment from other perennials. Some prefer to be grown warmer, some prefer to be grown cooler. But as a general rule of thumb, for bare root perennials, you want to find a greenhouse or a hoop house that's around 50 to 55 degrees for the first 10 to 14 days after potting. And this helps promote the root growth. And the idea is to get those feeder roots developed before you see much top growth, so that can support the crown. Once you start seeing some root growth, and you can dig down in there and just see those fine little hairy roots starting to grow out of the old roots, then that's a sign that you can start raising the temperatures up to about 55 to 60 degrees until it's finished. And then lower temperatures may be used to delay some growth, and then warmer temperatures can actually accelerate growth. So kind of keep an eye on your schedule as far as planting goes, and you can decide, hey, this needs to be growing a little bit warmer to push along, but be aware that sometimes you can experience some unwanted stretch with the warmer temperatures. So I gave you an example here of what some of the media we use here in our finished containers. And it's generally a pretty coarse mix. It's heavier on the pine bark. It's got some peat in it for moisture retention, and then we use some coarse perlite as well. And this is an excellent mix. It's something we've been using for quite a while now. I use a similar mix at my nursery as well. But generally, if you can find something that's like this, it would work really well. I know a lot of other growers mix their own soil or their own media. So it's just, I would err on the more coarse side if you're doing a lot of overhead watering, because good drainage is very important, especially if you're growing crops like sedums and perovskias. You know, they really require a lot of good drainage. So as far as tips for planting bare root perennials goes, most perennials like to be planted with their crowns even with the soil line or just slightly below the soil line. And then there's a few that benefit from being planted slightly higher. And most plants have the roots trimmed off to fit in a container. We do some root trimming here at Walters. You'll see some of the dailies. We did a lot of testing on that because we've had some of our customers say, hey, the roots are too long to fit in some containers. Can we trim these? So we did some testing a couple years back, and we found no negative effects to trimming those roots. So we decided with our daily production, we're going to be trimming all these roots for our customers so they can go directly into the container without any added work. So it's up to you. I mean, if you have a bare root plant that comes in, the roots are too long, I generally tend to trim a little bit rather than try to circle all those roots around in there, because I just have a feeling that, like, if you have too many old roots in there, if some of them die off, you just have more old material in there that could rot. So just I would spend a little bit of time just trimming some of those. And some things like Veronica tend to come in with longer roots. So just a nice soft trim on those works really well. And there's one thing that you do not want to trim, and that would be clematis roots. They do not like to be trimmed whatsoever. And then another thing to remember too, when planting bare root, it's very important that you get all the voids filled under the crown, especially plants like Baptisia. They got a large root system, and they tend to have good gaps underneath the crown. So you want to make sure you're using your fingers to kind of push all that soil in. If you leave a large air gap there, a lot of times some root rot sets in, and that plant eventually dies off. So I have a couple slides here of how to plant Baptisia. And you can see the bare root Baptisia plant there. Generally, this is going into a 2-gallon pot. So Baptisia have such a large root system, it's extremely important to give that plant the soil it needs to grow properly, that doesn't dry out too extremely or get root bound too quickly. So I'm trying to set that plant in there so the crown can be slightly below the soil line. And then here's an example of one planted incorrectly. And I see a lot of growers do this. They tend to leave the Baptisia a little too high in the container. And what happens is the plant will still grow just fine. But once that plant starts getting to be about a foot tall, some of the stems will start collapsing off to the side because there's no support for that plant. Now, when we dig these Baptisia out of the field, those eyes are set below the ground. You don't see those when we're digging them out of the field. So that's really where they should be, is slightly below soil surface or slightly exposed. So the next slide will show you the correct planted one. So just barely see the eyes above the soil line there. I would say it would be a good height to plant them.
All right, Jeremy, we're getting loads and loads of questions. I don't want anybody to think we're skipping your question. I'm just trying to look for things that happen to be right on the topic of what you are. We'll try to get to the rest at the end. But Rob wants to know about planting clematis deep or at root level. He said you mentioned not to trim the roots. Should you plant it deep or right at the root, or I guess you would say crown level?
Yes, yeah, the crown is typically on clematis is buried slightly below the soil line. Sometimes when you receive bare root clematis, there's usually a good size eye that's formed that's already starting to grow. I tend to try to get where that eye meets that crown roughly a ½ inch below the soil line. So that eye might be slightly above the soil line once it depends how far it's stretched, but that crown should be slightly below.
All right, and Gene is asking about fungicide dip prior to planting.
Yeah, I haven't really had much experience with dips prior to planting. We'll touch on some of the drenches that we'll talk about here shortly, but that's typically the route I go because it's less effort for me to do a drench in a container than it is to do all these dips.
All right, how about quick question, Monarda potting depth? Asks Lisa.
We don't sell bare root Monarda just because they're such a vigorously growing plant. They tend to not need to be from bare root. Plugs form just fine. But if you were to plant Monarda from bare root, I would expect it to be somewhat of a flatter crown, similar to like Coreopsis moonbeam with the runners. So you're going to want to get all those runners just slightly below the soil line and with the tips slightly exposed.
Okay, when she's specifying a plug, I would assume right at the soil level, right? of the plant?
Yeah, when we stick Monarda cuttings, we try to get at least 2 nodes below the soil line. And so I would say with Monarda plugs, maybe at the soil line or just ever so slightly deeper, because Monarda can form roots off that stem pretty easily.
Oh, kind of like a tomato, I guess. But
correct.
And and lastly, how about if we talk about pots here, planting directly into a landscape bed? Same principle?
Yeah, pretty much same principle. Planting depth is important, but obviously you want to loosen up enough soil around the plant to make sure it's not going to grow into rock hard soil. And then also the backfilling and watering in is going to be very important as well.
Gotcha.
All right, just finish up a few more tips on bare root perennials here. As far as watering in goes, you want to water in fairly heavy. You want to eliminate all the air pockets in the soil. That's extremely important. But then once you water them in, you want to allow that media to slightly dry until the new feeder roots develop. Now, I understand, like, you're going to do the initial watering in. You could either do the drench at that point, but typically I would water it in and then do a drench. It's easier for the material or for the chemicals to penetrate into the media, and then allow it to slightly dry. So really, it's a kiss of death to grow bare root plants that aren't active under extremely wet conditions. So you like to see that light browning. And then I know a lot of growers, if they don't check the moisture towards the bottom of the pot, just because the top looks dry doesn't mean the entire container is dry. So you want to check that quite often, because I like to see the top dry and the bottom moist, because it forces those new feeder roots to go down to the bottom of the container in search of that moisture. That's why I tend to grow them on the drier side until they're established. But you also want to grow these cool to allow the roots to form before pushing up much top growth. And then last but not least, you want to avoid feeding them until the plants begin to grow. Like I mentioned, these plants don't have the new feeder roots developed for maybe the first 8 to 10 days or so. You really don't want to be applying fertilizer at a high rate until those roots are able to pull that up. So otherwise you're going to just be building up a lot of soluble salts in the soil that aren't needed, and then you're just going to have to go back there and leach all that out. So really I would just start doing the liquid feeds more of when the plants start showing some growth. And then as far as like controlled release fertilizer, some growers blend it in. They should be fine, because that's not going to really release until the temperatures warm up a little bit. But yeah, just make sure you're not piling any slow release fertilizer as a top dress right at the crown. You want to spread that further away from the crown. So now we get into some of the perennials that grow better in cooler or warmer temperatures. And here's a list of some that grow great under cooler temperatures, at 50 to 55 degree temperature range. I'll just kind of touch on a few, like Baptisia. They push extremely fast if you grow them too warm. Astilbe would be one that will not develop roots, so it'll just push all top if it's grown too warm. And then what you'll see is eventually that top growth will wilt back and die because there was no roots to support it. Peonies and some of the other ones, especially like lavender, you get into the evergreen type plants, again, they like to be grown on the cooler side. And typically I like to put those directly outdoors after the frost has passed, and just put maybe a frost blanket on there for a little protection at night. It tends to do much better under those cooler temperatures. Some examples of bare root plants grown warm, extremely important with hibiscus. It's a heat-loving plant. It won't wake up much without much heat. Perovskia, same thing. Takes a lot of heat to get that thing active. Yeah, pretty much the temperature range you want to focus in on for these would be that 60 to 65 degree temperature. So now we get into the preventative drenches. I know we had a question earlier about doing a dip, but generally I like to drench them. And we recommend using a broad spectrum fungicide that covers root rots, crown rots, all that stuff. And this is an extremely important step for bare root plants. They're coming out of a field. They're not in a sterile environment. So it's just good added insurance that you're going to have an excellent crop. So it'll save you a lot of time and money in the long run. We use products. I've used Banrock quite often. Dabble in with a little bit more pageant with some of the trials I've seen as of late on that. And then Root Shield is a great option if you don't want to use a chemical. We at Walters apply a lot of Root Shield on our crops here, and it tends to do really, really well. So providing the right environment. As I mentioned, perennials may require multiple environments, and that's why I see hoop houses as a great option to grow perennials versus a gutter-connected greenhouse that's one large environment. With the smaller hoop houses, you can set multiple temperature zones. You can vent them differently, and some of the main things you want to pay attention to with providing a right environment are the temperature swings. And this year, we've had some very warm days already. We've had, I think, close to a 70-degree day in February, and so the temperature in the greenhouse, especially if it has clear poly, warms up quite quickly. So we had all the fans and vents running, try to keep things as cool as possible. Yeah, it's not nice when you start seeing plants wake up that, yeah, I'm trying to hold at 38 degrees or so. So venting is very important. Venting for humidity and condensation control is also very important. You don't want to be walking into a hoop house that's just dripping wet from the ceiling, causing a lot of excess moisture on the plants. This can cause foliar diseases during the growing season, as well as prevent the media from drying out to where it should be for the winter months. And we've kind of combated this at Walters using just a small fan, like a 12-inch little fan put into the wall that's connected with a humidistat. It doesn't even require a louver on the other end of the greenhouse. You're just trying to pull some of the humidity out of the air, trying to get some air exchange in there. And that really helps lower the humidity levels and keep the condensation under control. Also, utilizing polys that have the anti-drip really help as well. It allows that moisture to kind of roll down the sides and get to the edges of the greenhouse rather than dropping on the crop. And as far as growing perennials and overwintering, it's best to use white poly over cold frames to prevent the heat up on the sunny days. And then prop those doors open as soon as you get above the temperatures that are desired for the crop. And then, yeah, next slide. So as far as controlling moisture goes, like I mentioned earlier, bare root plants perform best when they're watered in well after planting, and then keeping them slightly dry until the new roots develop. And the media should be, that light brown color. We put together a pretty good little slide set up here at Walters that kind of educates our growers on the different moisture levels. We use a 1 to 5, 1 being the dry, or the extremely dry, 5 being extremely wet. And generally, we like to see things through the winter months being in around that 2 to 3, slightly dry. It's when you start seeing that that media is starting to get a little bit more darker color. You get in that 3. You feel a little bit of moisture on the media when you touch it. But that's really helped educate our growers on how to water properly. And then we can just tell them, hey, we need this to be held at a 3. But like most perennials, once you get them growing, generally it's going to be in that 3 range. We let them dry to a 2 and then water them back up to a 3. So overwintering under, oh, sorry, Chris, back up one more there. Let's see, overwintering under cool temperatures really avoids the root and crown rots. You want to get those new feeder roots developed again. We hit on that. Next one there. Proper feeding. As I mentioned earlier too, you want to put the nutrients on the plants when they need them, once the new feeder roots develop. And yeah, roughly 10 to 14 days is when you start applying the fertilizer. And for most bare root perennials, you're going to look at the moderate feeding range of around 75 to 100 parts per million. So nothing like what you fertilize annuals with, which is another reason why you shouldn't mix your perennial crop with your annual crop. And then for controlled release fertilizers, you want to utilize a medium rate, whether you're incorporating or you're top dressing. And if you use controlled release fertilizer, I would really recommend incorporating, trying to get the fertilizer spread out through the container rather than just in one spot near the crown. And then there's some heavier feeders like hibiscus that prefer a high rate. And usually with a liquid feed, we're feeding around 150 to 200 parts per million at each watering. So I'm mentioning a lot of things here. I just want you all to be aware that Walters does offer a simple, sensible solutions guide to growing perennials. And you're welcome to email our customer service on that. We can get you either a PDF copy right off our website or send you a paper copy as well. And it'll go into more of the details of what I'm talking about if you're looking for specific details. But getting to pinching now. Is pinching necessary? For most bare root plants, it really isn't. But some plants like hibiscus, it keeps the size in check and it helps create a better branched plant. In the top picture you see there is a hibiscus plant that was probably about, I'm guessing probably about 5 weeks old as far as the growth goes. And what that is there is about a week after the pinch. So you can see that light green growth, that's the new branches breaking out at the node. So that's the point there where I would typically start applying a PGR to that hibiscus. And then the photo below there, you see the results of a nice well-rounded plant from doing a pinch. Sometimes hibiscus can receive 2 pinches if you want a really full plant. But just keep in mind when pinching, there's a lot of times you can set the flowering date back. But I really think it's well worth it to get a nice full container. Generally for my nursery, I'm looking at growing premium perennials. I want nice full containers with a lot of flowers on it. So for like a hibiscus here, you're looking at around 6 weeks from the last pinch until it flowers. So just keep that in mind when you're scheduling your crops. And generally when you do a pinch, it's just removing the tip at the first node and just pinching it back and then allowing it to branch out at that point there. So when to apply PGRs? Like I mentioned earlier, I like to see a little bit of new growth after a pinch before I go and apply the PGR. With hibiscus, we're applying a drench typically, just because it seems to work the best for that. Hibiscus is such a vigorous crop that if you miss one branch with a spray, you're going to see it. It's going to shoot right up above the rest of them. So if you do a spray, it is advised to spray all around the plant from multiple directions. So as far as putting the PGR plan together, it's very important. Take the time to research it before you plant the crops. So when you put your order together, look and see if it's recommended to have a PGR applied to it, and research and find out what PGR would work best for you. We have a lot of great recommendations on our website under our cultural information that you can go to, but go into it with a plan. That's all I will say with that. And this will help control the desired size once you require to ship it. And it's best to apply early on in the growing cycle. You don't want to allow the plant to get stretched out and then try to stop the growth. The whole reason to apply PGRs is to manage growth. So typically we're looking at using lower rates than recommended and applying multiple applications. I tend to see the best results from that rather than applying a single high rate. A lot of times applying a high rate at one time, you're going to stunt the plant. So it's best to do a little bit of trialing if you're not familiar with PGRs. But if you're a grower that just wants to avoid PGRs altogether, there's a lot of great ways to control the plant size, controlling temperature, controlling moisture, and also mechanical or manual pinching. And as I mentioned earlier, just make sure that you're spraying the crops from multiple directions if you choose to use a spray. So here's a slide of a great display of some late summer crops. These are sedums, these are lavenders, Looks like some more catmint and ornamental grasses and some hibiscus in the background there. These are all 2- and 3-gallon containers. So this is an example of what a garden center or retailer could do for late summer sales. There's always great ways to think about how to draw a crowd into a garden center in late summer. And I think really offering buyers something that's a premium plant that's going to catch their eye, it's going to make them want to walk out with it, something that can create that instant gratification in the garden. A lot of consumers are looking for products like that, and so having a nice display like this with some plants, these are all grown from bare root. It makes it much easier to get that nice larger crop for late summer. So we put together a little marketing campaign last year just to show the benefits of Walter's bare root, and these are some of the trials that we did, just grow out trials. In the picture there, you can see the bare root hibiscus. So that gives you a general idea of what our bare root hibiscus look like if you've ever ordered those from us before. They tend to have roots that are, I would say, probably 14, 15 inches long on some of these when we dig them out of the field. So those are all clipped off to a tighter radius there, so it's manageable. It can go into a 2-gallon container. The picture you see there is a 3-gallon container, or a 1,000 pot, and that's a great container for a plant like that. And you can see the middle picture there, it's at 6 weeks old, and the far right would be the finished product at 12 weeks old. So there's an example of some grown out in our outdoor growing area here at Walter, some of our show plants. So it just shows you how nice and well-rounded a plant can be, and that was with a single pinch, grown directly outdoors. And I really think growing them outdoors with drip irrigation, it's a great way to grow a crop like this without having to invest in a lot of infrastructure costs. Here's some Perovskia. As I mentioned earlier, you can see the nice heavy woody crown that plant has. So that helps support and give you a nice full container in a matter of 12 weeks in flower. There's some grown outside again. These are 2 gallons that we did for a late summer event. And Phlox paniculata. Again, great eye development on these. You can see at 4 weeks old, it's already filling out that full 1-gallon container. It's not a trade gallon container. And then at 10 weeks old in flower. There's some 3-gallon bare root that we did. Now these 3-gallon, we had a shorter amount of time to produce these, so I put 2 bare root plants per pot there. But you can see how massive these are and the number of blooms on them. It's just amazing. So, you know, to do that from 2 plugs, it would take multiple years. And Veronica, as I mentioned earlier, this is one that tends to have a little bit longer roots, so feel free to trim them back to fit the containers necessary. But 6 weeks, you already have buds on there, and at 8 weeks, it has color. Now, this is a sedum slide I was talking to you about earlier. The one on the right is bare root, and the one on the left is a plug. You can see the branching is much higher on the plant on the left because of the pinch, and not near as full, where the one on the right is full from nice branching right down at the crown. And some Veronica again there. And some more Veronica. These are some I just took last week. This is Veronica Blue Skywalker on the left from bare root at 8 weeks, and that's at 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and then white wands on the right. So last thing I'm going to talk about is bare root hostas. This is something that maybe takes a little extra attention. And you want to be really careful on what time of year you plant these. Generally, hostas like to grow good roots under longer days. So avoid planting these late summer when the days are short, or late winter into early spring. The ideal time to get a plant like this in would be that late spring into early summer, all the way through midsummer. And we changed our production style a little bit here at Walters to really help give the customers a better plant. Generally in our summer production, we were digging these fresh out of the field, like you see in the right there. It's a grade 1 active bare root plant. We've done a lot of trials and grow out side by side and found that, hey, why don't we just dig all these hostas earlier in the season, so like late winter, early spring before they break dormancy, and give the customer a dormant plant. So we actually hold these in our freezer longer into the summer months, so we can ship a dormant plant as late as mid to late summer, depending on availability. So what we found out is it gives the customers a much better plant in a shorter amount of time. So as I mentioned earlier, grow hostas under long day conditions, and the bare root plants, as far as dormant ones go, finish much faster than fresh dug in the summer. And then let's see here. I think I covered all that there, Chris, so we can jump to the next one. So here's a slide showing you the results of our trial. These are actually grade 2 hostas planted into a trade 1 gallon container. And the one on the left you see is a example of the dormant hostas. And then the one on the right is an active hosta that was planted as an active plant. So what that does is it basically has that plant, it has more stored up energy in it. So it allows to push better root growth and better top growth. So this was potted in early June, and this photo was taken in late August. So as I mentioned earlier, avoid fall planting times, and then as far as the depth goes, make sure that you're planting these eyes slightly below the soil line. Do not plant hostas too high, as you might cause that crown to dry out. And then the roots can be trimmed to fit the container, but the hostas are something we typically would do the root pruning for you. And hostas are moderate feeders, so you're feeding around 75 to 125 parts per million at each watering, or use a medium rate of controlled release fertilizer. And then as far as going into the late summer into early fall, what I do with a lot of my hostas is as the growth starts slowing, you tend to notice some of these leaves are starting to look a little ratty. The plant's just going semi-asleep, I guess. That's the point I would generally leach out the salts from the plant before it goes dormant. You don't want a hosta going to sleep with a lot of soluble salts built up into the soil. And if you're not familiar with ECs, pH readings, and soluble salts, we have a great YouTube video on our website that you can go to, and it teaches you all about how to test for that. There's a little bit of detail that goes into it, but I highly recommend if you're not testing for those things, be sure that you do. It's really changed my growing style once I realized what's in the container and how to control all that. So as far as overwintering goes, it's best to overwinter hostas in a minimally heated hoop house. You generally see much less loss that way. But if you're doing it in an unheated greenhouse or hoop house, generally recommend white poly, again, in extreme cold conditions, covering that up with a heavy-duty frost blanket for added protection. And I believe that is it. So if anybody has any questions, I don't know how much time we have left, but I'd love to answer them.
Well, let's take a few minutes to go through some. If some folks have to sign off, you know that the archive will be out there at ballpublishing.com/webinars, and I'll share that again. Let me skim through here and look for some of the questions that we had, because we did answer a few of them along the way. Let's see. Hang on just a second. A few emails about people who were having problems with their sound, but we got all of them squared away. Stacy wants to know about ornamental grasses from bare root. Do you consider an ornamental grass a bare root when it's shipped in as a, as a bare root?
Walters does offer some varieties in bare root. They typically tend to be some of the bigger selling varieties. One that comes to mind would be like Calamagrostis Carl Forster, which is a cool season grass. Yeah, if you can get them in bare root, it's a great way to go, especially if you're looking at doing a 2 or 3 gallon container again. Generally, for my production style, I like to go with the larger plugs planted in midsummer for a lot of the ornamental grasses. But yeah, for that larger quick turn container, bare root's excellent way to go. Generally, you want to plant them with a crown even with the soil line. It's extremely important, though, that those get planted right away. I put them right up there in priority with the evergreen type plants. Grasses can be a little finicky. And also, that might be a plant too that you might want to pre-soak some of those roots too if they've been shipped for a while. Usually when you receive bare root grasses, you're going to see that they're packed a little differently. They're typically packed in with sphagnum peat moss. And what that does is it helps retain some moisture around the crown and those roots so they arrive to you fresh. But just be aware that you watch your warm season grasses and your cool season grasses and put them in the right environment.
There you go. Luann says she's received some bare roots that had mold on them. Should that be cut off before planting, or won't it matter? Any suggestions?
Now, generally, the mold, as long as you don't notice any like really mushy roots or anything like that, it's generally something that you could just wipe off, or like I said, you open the container, you open the boxes and let them air out for just a little bit. A lot of it tends to disappear. It's totally up to the grower. If they feel more comfortable removing that, that's fine. But generally, it does not affect the plant at all. I mean, if it was sitting like that in those conditions for an extremely long time, yes. But once you plant it, it just pretty much disappears.
Make sure you plant it when you get it.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Stephen wants to know what you're using, Walters, for a field herbicide.
Boy, you're getting out of my expertise there. We use a lot of manual weeding. That's probably the most important thing, is to have a good weeding crew. We do our best to keep our fields as clean as possible, and it gets tougher and tougher every year with the labor shortage. But yeah, that would be something that if you want to email me on, I'd be glad to find out and get back to you on that.
There you go. Stick on, and we'll share that email address. Craig wants to know about bare roots that you can buy in vernalized, or which ones you can vernalize.
Sure. Most of the plants that you receive, I would say up until probably June, or probably more into May, are going to be vernalized. There's typically, like if you would buy something in like mid to late summer on our summer special program, those tend to not have been vernalized. But I would say probably 95% of what you would buy bare root from Walters Gardens would be received vernalized at purchase in the spring.
Right, because you've grown it over the winter out in the field.
Correct, yep. Right. Yeah, the only exception would be like some dahlias or hostas or something like that. They'd probably be actively growing, but typically the vernalization wouldn't be a key factor in growing that plant at that point.
All right. Specific question about Perovskia. Would you plant that in the fall or the spring from a bare root?
From bare root, I would go for spring. I would say that generally with most bare root, with the exception, like I mentioned, peonies, I see that as a great fall planted item from bare root. But there's no reason to take the risk in overwintering something when you can plant it in the spring and have just as good of a plant. I don't see any benefit of trying to root that plant out that late in the season, especially with Perovskia being a very heat-loving plant. It's pretty tough to get much growth on it before it has to go dormant. So I would just say wait till spring.
All right. Laura is apparently looking to plant lavender in a field and wondered if you have any recommendations. Bare root lavender in the field.
Yeah. I'm sure it can be done. There's a couple ways you could do it. I mean, I would probably err on the cautious side and put it in a container first and then root it out and then put that into the field that way. That way you have more of an active plant going in the ground rather than one that's semi-dormant. I think you'll have better success that way too, because you can control the environment much better when it's in a container than you can in the ground. My only concern was that it was an evergreen plant. I think that would be the better way to go.
All right. Stephen says, comments, do not use ban rot on clematis.
Yes, that's a great thing. I have read that too. I've never worried about drenching clematis before, and yeah, that's a great point.
All right, let's see. Here's a question. Why are many of the hosta varieties from Walters now only offered as plugs versus bare root? Bruce wants to know.
Yeah, that is a great question. And that's typically because of the way it's produced. A majority of the field-grown hostas are varieties that are done from division, when you buy a hosta from the greenhouse, it's either in a 20 count or a 72 count plug. Those are from tissue culture. So a lot of the newer genetics, they're grown in labs and then they're put in plugs. So we do a little bit more work each year to see, hey, is there another variety that we can add to our field production? But if you got to think of our growing conditions here. We're not covering hundreds and hundreds of acres of fields with shade cloth. So we have to put varieties out in the field that can handle some more sun. Not to say that, I recommend growing all these out in direct sun for retail-wise, but some of these come out of the field looking pretty rough, but our idea is to get the roots developed on them and get you a nice heavy crown. So that's all things we have to take into consideration before we offer something as bare root.
All right, and last question I'm going to take right now. Garrett wants to know what you consider a medium or moderate rate of feed on control rate fertilizers. That might be a label kind of a thing, wouldn't it?
Yeah. It's different when you're top dressing or incorporating. I would say medium. I want to say like for a 1 gallon would be in that maybe like a tablespoon or so. Generally, like when we're applying it into an incorporation, I want to say we're in that maybe that 8 to 10 pound per cubic yard range.
All right. There are a few more questions that keep coming in, so we got to knock it off someplace. It'll be time for dinner. But if you have more questions, and if I didn't get to yours, my apologies. However, Jeremy is happy to answer 24/7. Operators are standing by, right, Jeremy? And he is
I'll do my best.
Jeremy at waltersgardens.com. How hard could that be? And if you want more information from Walters themselves about their great varieties, we've got phone, we've got the email address and web addresses as well.
And a new website too, a lot of great information on it, so be sure to check it out.
And it looks like Perennial Resource. Is that the one you're talking about?
Yeah, Walters Gardens will be the one for the growers. Perennial Resource is going to be the one for more consumer information.
All right, great stuff. And as I promised, this webinar will be archived at the same place you signed up, ballpublishing.com/webinars. I'll get Jen Zerko on the job as soon as we finish up here. And just so you know, I've got an upcoming webinar a week from today, also on a perennial topic, but this time specifically spring blooming hellebores, hybrid hellebores. You may want to tune into that one, Jeremy.
I'd be interested.
Next Tuesday, March 7th, 1 o'clock Eastern, noon Central. So, all that said, I want to say thanks on behalf of Jeremy and all of the bare root perennial plants there at Walters Gardens, my stellar staff at Ball Publishing, who love getting free perennial samples, hint, hint. For all of them, I'm Chris Beytes saying, Happy Fat Tuesday, everybody.